The laughter died in Amara's throat like a bird shot mid-flight. One moment she was standing in the center of the street gathering, her warm brown eyes twinkling as she shared stories of her patients at the clinic. The children sat cross-legged at her feet, the elderly nodded with knowing smiles, and even the skeptical teenagers listened despite themselves. Nurse Amara had that gift. She could make anyone feel heard, seen, important. And then little Kemi looked at me with those big eyes and said, "Sister Amara, if I'm very good, will God give me new lungs?" Amara's voice carried the perfect mix of heartbreak and hope that made her such a beloved storyteller. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the conclusion, when suddenly Amara's hand flew to her chest. Her face twisted in confusion, then alarm. I can't," she gasped, her words becoming strangled whispers. "Amara." Oba rushed forward, his carpenter's hands strong and sure as they caught her falling body. "Someone call an ambulance." From the edge of the crowd, Noria pressed forward, her face a mask of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My sister," she cried, but observant neighbors might have noticed how she hung back, how her tears seemed to come too easily, how her mouth almost curved upward at the corners. The ambulance sirens wailed through the evening air like morning songs, and as the red lights faded into the distance, carrying Amara away, Noria stood watching with her hands folded and a secret satisfaction warming her chest. 3 weeks earlier, the morning sun had painted the clinic walls gold as Amara finished her rounds. She moved between beds like a gentle breeze, checking temperatures, adjusting pillows, whispering words of comfort that seemed to heal as much as any medicine. "That girl has the heart of an angel," old Papa Taiwo said to his wife as they watched through the window. "The whole town loves her. But not everyone." 2 blocks away, in the modest house they shared, Noria scraped burnt porridge from a pot and listened to the praise drifting through her window. Always Amara. Always the precious nurse sister, who could do no wrong. "Do you remember when we were children?" Noria whispered to her reflection in the dirty water. "Before everyone decided you were the golden child?" She remembered playground games where Amara was always chosen first, school programs where their parents beamed at Amara's perfect recitations while Noria stumbled over simple words. She remembered boys who came calling with flowers, asking shyly if beautiful Amara might walk with them, never noticing quiet Noria reading in the corner. "Noria has her own gifts," their mother used to say, but even she sounded uncertain. When Oba had first come to their door 5 years ago, Noria's heart had leaped. Finally, someone who might see past Amara's glow. But his eyes had found Amara instantly, completely, as if Noria were invisible furniture. "Your sister is remarkable," he'd told Noria once, thinking it was a compliment. "You must be so proud." Proud. The word tasted like ashes. That evening, as Amara returned home humming and glowing with the day's good deeds, Noria watched from the kitchen doorway. Her sister moved through life like she was swimming in warm honey. Everything sweet, everything easy, everything blessed. "How was your day?" Amara asked, genuinely interested, genuinely kind. "Fine," Noria replied, and the word held 28 years of accumulated bitter silence. The medicine cabinet in their shared bathroom held all of Amara's secrets, her mild anxiety medication, vitamins, the occasional headache relief. Such ordinary bottles, such innocent white pills. Noria stood before the mirror at midnight, her hands steady as a surgeon's as she opened the bottle labeled for heart palpitations, take as needed. Amara had been having dizzy spells lately, stress from the clinic she claimed. The doctor had prescribed these tiny pills to regulate her heart rhythm. From her pocket, Noria withdrew an identical bottle, identical except for the contents. These pills looked the same, felt the same, but they would do the opposite of healing. She'd bought them from a desperate man who haunted the back alleys near the market, a man who asked no questions when money changed hands. Just enough to make someone very sick, he'd assured her. Weak heart, breathing problems, collapse. But not enough to... But Noria had mixed the bottles herself, increasing the dose. If someone was going to suffer, they might as well suffer completely. Now you'll know what it feels like to be powerless, she whispered to her reflection, but in her mind she was speaking to Amara. Now you'll know what it's like to have everyone look through you, past you, beyond you to something better. She replaced the bottles exactly as they'd been, erased all evidence of her midnight work, and slipped back to bed where she lay awake listening to Amara's peaceful breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. Tomorrow, Amara would wake to another day of being beloved, cherished, perfect. She would take her morning medication with the same trusting smile she gave everyone, and finally, Noria would watch her sister's charmed life crumble. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, lying in the darkness, Noria felt something cold settle in her chest. But envy was a parasite that had been feeding on her for so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to be whole. The fluorescent lights in Mercy General Hospital hummed like mechanical prayers, casting everything in harsh, truthful white. Oba paced the waiting room floor until the tiles might have worn thin, his work boots squeaking against the polished surface with each anxious step. Family of Amara Okoro? The doctor's voice cut through the antiseptic air like a blade. Noria and Oba rushed forward, faces painted with matching expressions of desperate hope. But the doctor's shoulders told the story before his mouth opened, the slight slump of defeat, the way his hands hung at his sides like surrendered flags. "I'm sorry," Dr. Adelik said, and the words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples of disbelief in all directions. "We did everything we could." Her heart, it just stopped responding. The attack was too severe.
No.
Oba's voice cracked like a boy's. No. She was fine this morning. She was laughing, His large hands grasped at nothing, trying to hold onto a reality that was slipping away. "Sometimes these things happen suddenly," the doctor continued gently. "Hidden heart conditions, undiagnosed weaknesses. Young people think they're invincible until—" "She didn't make it?" Noria's voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes held a glimmer that she quickly buried beneath manufactured tears. The doctor shook his head, professional sympathy etched in every line of his face. "She passed at 11:47 p.m. I'm truly sorry for your loss." Oba's knees buckled, as if someone had kicked his legs out from under him. He collapsed into a plastic chair that was never designed to hold the weight of such grief, his sobs echoing off the hospital walls like a lament for all the world's unfairness. Noria knelt beside him, her arm around his shaking shoulders, making all the right sounds of comfort while inside her chest, something dark and satisfied purred like a fed cat. She had won. Finally, definitively, completely won. But victories built on graves have a way of haunting the victorious. News traveled through their small town like spilled water, finding every crack and crevice. By sunrise, half the community had heard about Amara's death. By noon, the other half was planning how to honor her memory. "Such a good girl," Mama Dunny wept as she pounded yam for the morning meal. "Always helping, always smiling. What kind of world takes angels so young?" The pastor at St. Paul's Methodist cleared his schedule immediately. The Women's Auxiliary canceled their usual meeting to plan funeral arrangements. The children from the clinic drew pictures with broken crayons, their artwork showing Amara with wings and a halo, which they left at the door of the house she'd shared with Noria. And Noria rose to the occasion like cream rising to the surface. "Please," she told the gathered neighbors, her voice thick with perfectly performed grief. "Let me handle the arrangements. It's the least I can do for my dear sister." She paid for the best casket the town had seen, mahogany polished to mirror brightness. She ordered flowers from 3 different cities to ensure the church would overflow with fragrance. She hired musicians and catered food and insisted that everyone should come to celebrate Amara's life. "So generous in grief," people whispered. "Look how much she loved her sister." But in the market, as Noria haggled over flower arrangements, old Mama Ino watched from her herb stall with ancient eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. "This death is not natural," she muttered to her dried roots and bottled remedies. "Death has a smell, a feeling. This smells of something else. The other market women shushed her. Don't speak ill of the dead, old woman. But Mama Ino had been reading signs in the patterns of birds and the behavior of shadows for 70 years. She knew the difference between death that came from God and death that came from human hands. Mark my words, she said, grinding herbs with movements that looked like prayer. The truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. 3 days passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences, of visitors who spoke in hushed tones and neighbors who couldn't meet Oba's eyes. The funeral was set for Friday evening, giving people time to travel from neighboring towns to pay their respects to the beloved nurse who had touched so many lives. But in the spaces between official mourning, questions began to whisper like wind through grass. Didn't she seem healthy just last week? Asked Mama Joyce, selecting tomatoes with unusual intensity. My cousin is a nurse in the capital, replied Auntie Blessing, lowering her voice. She says young people don't just die of heart failure unless something is very wrong. At the barber shop, the men's conversations paused and restarted, like engines that couldn't quite turn over. Strange thing, muttered Papa Brahim, stroking his gray beard. My grandfather always said when someone dies before their time, look for who benefits most. What are you suggesting? Asked the barber, but his hands paused in their work. Nothing. Nothing at all. Just who stands to gain from Amara being gone. The answer hung in the air unspoken. Noria, who would now inherit Amara's savings, Amara's reputation by association, Amara's claim on Oba's heart, if she played her grief correctly. These whispers might have remained just whispers, marketplace gossip that would fade with the next week's scandal, if not for Mama Ino. She had been watching, listening, reading the signs that others missed. And on Thursday night, as the sun set red as blood over the town, she made a decision that would change everything. If the living won't speak truth, she said to her cat, who was the only witness to her preparations, then perhaps the dead will have to speak for themselves. She gathered her most potent herbs, her strongest oils, and set out for the mortuary as storm clouds gathered overhead like dark thoughts made manifest. Thunder rolled across the sky like God clearing his throat as Mama Ino approached the mortuary. Rain lashed the corrugated roof in rhythms that sounded almost like talking drums, perhaps the ancestors trying to tell her something, perhaps just the storm announcing its power. The night watchman was sleeping, as she'd known he would be. Young men never believed that the dead could do them harm, never understood that midnight was when the boundary between worlds grew thin as old cloth. She slipped inside with movements quiet as shadow, her bare feet making no sound on the concrete floor. The building smelled of formaldehyde and flowers, of endings and artificial preservation. But underneath those expected scents, Mama Ino detected something else, something that made her ancient nose wrinkle with recognition. Poison, she whispered. Someone sent you to the other side with poison. Amara lay in the preparation room, beautiful even in death, her skin gray pallid but peaceful. She wore the white dress that Noria had chosen, hands folded across her chest like a prayer interrupted mid-word. Mama Ino opened her bag and began to work. She sprinkled herbs around the body. Bitter cola for clarity, African potato for strength, roots whose names she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned them from hers. She lit candles that flickered in the storm's wind and chanted in the old language, words that predated English, predated missionaries, predated the forgetting of ancient wisdom. If death came too early, she sang whispered, if death came from evil hands, if the soul is not ready to go, come back, daughter. Come back and tell the truth that the living refuse to speak. The candle flames danced higher. Thunder shook the building, and in the white dress on the metal table, Amara's finger twitched. The first thing Amara felt was cold, bone-deep, soul-touching cold that seemed to seep from the metal beneath her body into every cell. The second thing she felt was confusion, so complete it left her dizzy. She sat up slowly, her body moving like it belonged to someone else, and immediately began shivering violently. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the street gathering, Oba's worried face, the taste of metal in her mouth. Easy, child. Easy. Mama Ino's voice cut through her panic like a warm hand on a fevered forehead. You are between worlds right now. Moving too quickly could send you back. Back where? Amara's voice came out as a croak. What? Where am I? The mortuary. You have been dead for 3 days. The words should have been impossible to understand, but somehow Amara's heart, her supposedly failed heart, knew they were true. She could feel the weight of those 3 days, could sense the grief that had washed over the town like flood water.
Dead.
She touched her chest, felt the slow, uncertain beating of her heart. But Someone sent you to the other side with poison, Mama Ino said, her voice matter-of-fact as if she were discussing the weather. But your time is not finished. The ancestors sent me to call you back. Memory came flooding back in pieces. The dizzy spells, the medicine she'd been taking, the way Noria had watched her with eyes that held too much satisfaction. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. Noria, she whispered.
Yes.
But do not reveal everything yet. Mama Ino helped her down from the table, wrapping her in a thick blanket that smelled of wood smoke and ancient wisdom. Let the truth expose itself. People must see with their own eyes who your sister really is.
Why?
Amara's teeth chattered as much from shock as from cold. Why would she? But even as she asked, she knew the answer. She had always known, hadn't she? Had seen the way Noria's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way her kindness felt performed rather than genuine, the way she seemed to feed on small disappointments and minor failures. Envy is a sickness, Mama Ino said simply. And sick people do sick things. Why me? The question came out as a sob. I loved her. I would have shared everything. That is exactly why, Mama Ino replied, guiding her toward the door. Some people would rather destroy what they cannot have than allow anyone else to enjoy it. Mama Ino's herb shop squatted between the tailor's workshop and the phone booth, like a wise old woman keeping secrets. The building was barely more than a shack, with walls of rusted corrugated iron and a roof that leaked hope during rainy season. But inside, it smelled like healing, like eucalyptus and ginger, and all the growing things that knew how to make the body remember wellness. You will stay here, Mama Ino said, settling Amara onto a mat in the back room. But you must be invisible. No one can know you live until the time is right. Amara pulled the borrowed wrapper closer around her shoulders. When will that be? Your own funeral is tomorrow evening. That is when you will make your appearance. The thought should have been terrifying, but Amara felt only a strange calm descending over her like morning mist. She was alive, unexplainably, impossibly alive, and that meant she had been given a gift. A chance to witness her own death, to see who mourned authentically and who performed grief like a play. Drink this. Mama Ino handed her a cup of bitter tea that tasted like bark and earth and things that grew in dark places. It will make your body remember how to be alive again. Throughout that day, as Amara dozed and recovered, she could hear the sounds of the town preparing for her funeral. Hammers building a platform for speakers, vehicles arriving with out-of-town guests, the murmur of voices discussing flower arrangements and seating plans. But as evening approached, she heard something else. Footsteps outside the shop, pausing uncertainly. I know someone is in there, a voice whispered. A voice she knew better than her own. Oba. Through a crack in the wooden shutters, Amara saw him standing in the alley, staring at the herb shop with eyes wild with hope and confusion. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, like grief was eating him from the inside out. I saw someone who looked like. He shook his head, talking to himself. But that's impossible. People don't come back. People don't. Mama Ino appeared at the door, like she had materialized from air itself.
Go home, son, she said gently. Rest.
Tomorrow will bring what tomorrow brings. But I saw. Oba's voice cracked like a teenage boy's. You saw shadows and wishful thinking, Mama Ino replied, but her tone was kind. The heart sees what it needs to see. After he left, Amara wept, for his pain, for the cruel trick death had played on them both, for the sister who had loved her so little that she'd chosen murder over sharing. Tomorrow, she whispered to the herbs and roots that surrounded her like silent witnesses. Tomorrow, everything changes. Oba spent that night walking the streets of their small town like a man haunted. Every shadow looked like Amara. Every sound of wind through trees sounded like her laughter. The rational part of his mind, the part that knew how to measure wood and calculate angles and build things that stood solid and true, insisted that the dead stayed dead. But love was not rational. Love remembered the way Amara's hand felt in his, the exact pitch of her voice when she said his name, the smell of her hair after she'd spent a day at the clinic helping sick children. And that same love swore that it had glimpsed her alive, moving, breathing near the herb seller's shop. "I'm losing my mind," he told the empty street. "Grief is making me see things." But when he passed the mortuary, when he saw the building where her body lay waiting for tomorrow's ceremony, something deep in his chest rejected the idea completely. That body in the white dress. It looked like Amara, but it felt wrong. Too still, too absent, like a photograph of a person rather than the person herself. He found himself back at Mama Ino's shop as the sun rose, standing in the exact spot where he'd seen. What had he seen? The old woman emerged as if she'd been expecting him, carrying a cup of something that steamed in the morning air. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," she observed. "I keep thinking I see her," he admitted, too tired to maintain pride. "I know it's impossible, but what if it isn't impossible?" Mama Ino asked quietly. The question hung between them like a bridge he was afraid to cross. "What do you mean?" "I mean that death and life are not always as final as people think. I mean that sometimes the ancestors intervene when injustice is done. I mean that you should trust what your heart tells you, even if your mind insists it's impossible." She handed him the cup. It smelled like hope tastes. "But not yet," she added as he opened his mouth to ask more questions. "Tonight, at the funeral, trust what you see. Trust what you feel. And trust that love knows the difference between death and sleep." "Not yet," Oba repeated, but something in his chest had begun to sing. "Not yet," Mama Ino confirmed. "But soon. Very soon." The morning of her own funeral, Amara woke before dawn with the strangest feeling, like she was preparing for the most important performance of her life. In a way, she supposed she was. "Are you ready?" Mama Ino asked, offering her a fresh cup of bitter tea and a wrapper dyed deep blue, the color of depth and truth. "I don't know how someone can be ready for something like this," Amara admitted. "What if people think I'm a ghost? What if they run away screaming?" "Some will," Mama Ino said matter-of-factly. "Fear makes people do foolish things. But others will see the truth, that you are alive, that someone tried to murder you, that justice demands witnesses." As the day progressed, Amara could hear the town coming alive with funeral preparations. Chairs being arranged in the church courtyard, vehicles arriving from neighboring communities, the sound of women singing traditional mourning songs that made her chest tight with emotion. Through the cracks in the shop's walls, she glimpsed pieces of her own funeral. Flowers in abundance, people dressed in their finest clothes, children who had drawn pictures of angels to honor her memory. "They really do love me," she whispered, wonder mixing with sorrow. "Yes," Mama Ino agreed. "Which is why your sister's jealousy grew so poisonous. Love like that is hard to ignore." As sunset approached, painting the sky the color of old blood, Mama Ino began her final preparations. She helped Amara wash with soap scented with African black soap and shea butter, braided her hair with beads that caught the last light, and wrapped her in the blue cloth like she was a gift being prepared for presentation. "Remember," the old woman said as they prepared to leave the shop, "walk slowly. Speak clearly. Show no anger toward your sister, only sadness. Let people see the contrast between her performance and your truth. What if she denies everything?"
"She will."
"But lies have a smell, and truth has a light. People will know the difference." The church bells began to ring, calling the community to witness what they believed would be Amara's final goodbye. Instead, it would be her return from the dead, and the beginning of justice. "Come, daughter," Mama Eno said, opening the door to the evening air. It's time to interrupt your own funeral. St. Paul's Methodist Church overflowed like a cup filled past capacity. People stood in the aisles, gathered outside the windows. Children perched on parents' shoulders to catch glimpses of the mahogany casket that held their beloved nurse Amara. Pastor Williams had prepared his finest eulogy, the one he reserved for truly good people who died too young. The church choir hummed, blessed assurance, in harmonies that made grown men weep. Women fanned themselves with funeral programs that bore Amara's smiling photograph. And at the front of the church, Noria sat in the widow's position that should have belonged to Oba, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepting condolences with the grace of someone who had finally found her moment in the spotlight. She was my heart, Noria told people, her voice catching at exactly the right moments. My dearest sister, my closest friend. I don't know how I'll go on without her. Oba sat behind her, grief carved into every line of his face, but something in his posture suggested he was waiting for something. His eyes kept moving to the church doors as if expecting what? Pastor Williams rose to begin the service. We gather today not to mourn the death of our sister Amara, but to celebrate a life well lived, a heart that loved unconditionally. The church doors opened, a collective intake of breath, as if the entire congregation had simultaneously gasped. Amara stood in the doorway, backlit by the dying sun, wearing blue like the deepest part of the ocean. She looked pale, thinner than she had in life, but undeniably, impossibly alive. Her eyes swept over the assembled crowd with infinite sadness, taking in the flowers, the tears, the shock that was spreading like wildfire through the sanctuary. My God, someone whispered. It's her, breathed another voice. Impossible, said a third. Amara walked slowly down the aisle, her bare feet making no sound on the concrete floor. The crowd parted before her like water before the prow of a boat, some people reaching out to touch her, others shrinking back in fear. She walked past Oba, whose face had transformed from grief to wonder to absolute certainty. She walked past neighbors and friends and strangers who had come to honor her memory. She walked to the front of the church where Noria sat frozen, her mouth open, her handkerchief fallen to the floor. Hello, sister, Amara said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. I seem to have missed my own funeral.
The screaming started then.
Some people fled. Others fell to their knees. Children cried, and adults called on Jesus, and the entire carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolved into chaos and wonder and fear. But Amara stood calm at the center of the storm, waiting for the noise to settle, so she could begin telling the truth. In the aftermath of chaos, when the initial screaming had died down to whispers and nervous laughter, the community found itself divided into three camps: believers, skeptics, and those too frightened to choose a side. The believers gathered around Oba, who had not left Amara's side since she appeared in the doorway. They touched her hands, felt the warmth of her skin, listened to the sound of her breathing. It's really her, insisted Mama Adunni, who had known Amara since birth. Same scar on her palm from when she fell as a child, same way of tilting her head when she listens. But the skeptics, led by some of the more educated members of the community, insisted on rational explanations. People don't rise from the dead, declared Mr. Emeka, who taught at the secondary school. This must be a trick, some kind of elaborate deception. Perhaps she was never really dead. I saw the body, said Dr. Adelik, who had arrived from the hospital upon hearing the commotion. I pronounced her dead myself. Then explain this, Oba challenged, his arm protective around Amara's shoulders. Explain how she's here, breathing, speaking, alive. The third group huddled near the church walls, too frightened to approach, but too fascinated to leave. They whispered about ghosts and spirits, about unfinished business and supernatural justice. And in the center of it all sat Noria, who had not moved from her front row seat, who stared at her sister with eyes wide as dinner plates and a face white as communion wafers. This is impossible, she kept repeating. This is a curse upon us. The dead should stay buried. Why should I stay buried, sister? Amara asked gently, settling into the chair beside her.
I was not ready to die. My work was not finished.
My life was not complete.
But you were sick,
Noria stammered.
Your heart.
My heart is fine, Amara replied, and there was something in her tone that made the church fall silent again. My heart was poisoned, but it is fine now. The word poisoned fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. What are you saying? Pastor Williams asked, his voice careful and measured. But before Amara could answer, Mama Eno stepped forward from the crowd where she had been watching and listening. I am saying that death has many faces, the old woman declared, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades. And not all of them are natural. I am saying that some deaths come from God's timing and others come from human hands. I am saying that truth has a way of refusing to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. She looked directly at Noria as she spoke, and something in her ancient eyes made the younger woman flinch as if she'd been struck. The battle has just begun, Mama Eno concluded ominously. Truth and lies cannot exist in the same space forever. One must give way to the other. In the 3 days that followed the interrupted funeral, the town buzzed with speculation and fear. Some people crossed the street when they saw Amara approaching. Others brought her gifts of food and flowers, as if she were a saint returned from heaven. But everyone had an opinion about what her return meant. Oba found himself at the center of the controversy, his loyalty to Amara making him a target for both criticism and pity. That boy is not right in the head, whispered Annie Funme at the market. Embracing a ghost like it's natural. Maybe she's not really dead, suggested Papa Cola. Maybe the doctors made a mistake. Or maybe, said Mr. Emeka darkly, he's so desperate to have her back that he's willing to accept anything that looks like her, even if it's something unnatural. But Oba knew better. He had loved Amara for 5 years, had memorized every detail of her face, every inflection of her voice, every gesture of her hands. The woman who had walked into the church was not a ghost or an imposter or a desperate man's delusion. I'd know her touch anywhere, he declared when a group of concerned neighbors came to talk sense into him. I'd know her laugh, her smell, the way she hums when she's thinking. This is Amara, alive and real and returned to me. But how do you explain? Began Mrs. Ochuba. I don't need to explain anything, Oba interrupted. I don't need to understand how or why. I only need to trust what I know to be true, that the woman I love is alive, and someone tried to kill her, and justice needs to be done. That evening, as he and Amara walked hand in hand through the town square, they could feel eyes watching them from every window, every doorway, every shadow. Are you sorry? Amara asked quietly. Sorry that loving me makes you the target of gossip? Oba stopped walking and turned to face her fully. I would rather be thought crazy for loving you alive than be thought sane for accepting you dead, he said. Whatever happened, however you came back, you are here. That's all that matters to me. But even as he spoke the words, he could see the doubt in some people's eyes, could hear the whispers that followed in their wake. The town was choosing sides, and not everyone was choosing theirs. The real test, he knew, would come when the truth about her death was finally revealed. And from the way Noria had been behaving since the funeral, jumpy, pale, speaking to herself when she thought no one was listening, that revelation might come sooner than anyone expected. Desperation makes people dangerous, and Noria had reached the point where desperation was all she had left. For 3 sleepless nights, she had paced her house like a caged animal, muttering prayers and curses in equal measure. Her sister was supposed to be dead. Dead and buried and mourned and forgotten, leaving Noria to finally step into the light that had always been denied her. Instead, Amara had returned more beloved than ever, transformed by her brief encounter with death into something approaching sainthood in the community's eyes. It's not fair, Noria whispered to her reflection in the cracked bedroom mirror. I did everything right. I planned everything perfectly. She should be gone. But if poison hadn't worked permanently, perhaps superstition would. Father Okoro was known throughout the region as a man who took spiritual warfare seriously. He traveled from town to town, conducting cleansing services for communities plagued by what he deemed unholy influences. His reputation was built on dramatic exorcisms and elaborate purification rituals that left audiences both terrified and satisfied. Noria sought him out on the fourth day after Amara's return, finding him at a revival meeting in the next town over. "Father," she said, kneeling before him with tears streaming down her face, "my community is in crisis. Something unholy has come among us, pretending to be my dead sister. The people are confused, frightened. Some are beginning to worship this thing, as if it were an angel." Father Okoro's eyes lit up with the fervor of a man who had found his next holy mission. "Tell me everything, my daughter." Noria spun her story carefully. Amara had died of natural causes, been properly buried, but had returned claiming to be alive. The community was being torn apart by this demonic deception. People were losing their faith, questioning the natural order, being led astray by false miracles. "She must be cast out," Noria concluded. "The town must be cleansed of her unholy presence." "Indeed," Father Okoro agreed, his voice thundering with righteous authority. "I will come tomorrow. We will have a purification service, and this demon pretending to be your sister will be exposed for what it truly is." But as he spoke, something flickered across his weathered features. A brief shadow that might have been recognition, or doubt, or the spiritual equivalent of a dog catching an unfamiliar scent. "Tell me, daughter," he said more quietly, "what manner of woman was your sister when she lived?" "Good," Noria said quickly. "Very good. Too good, perhaps. The whole community loved her, almost worshipped her." Father Okoro nodded slowly.
"Ah, and you?
"What was your relationship with this sainted sister?" For just a moment, Noria's mask slipped, and he saw the raw envy beneath her grief, the bitter resentment that had been festering for decades. "I loved her," she lied, but her voice rang false as a cracked bell. "Of course," Father Okoro murmured. "Of course you did." But privately, he began to wonder if the demon he'd been called to cast out was the one standing before him, not the one who had returned from the dead. While Noria plotted with Father Okoro, Mama Ino was conducting her own investigation. The old woman had not lived 70 years without learning how to read the signs that others missed, and everything about Amara's death had smelled wrong from the beginning. She returned to the house the sisters had shared, ostensibly to help Noria clean out Amara's belongings for charity. But while Noria sorted through clothes and jewelry in the bedroom, Mama Ino made her way to the bathroom medicine cabinet. "Looking for something specific, Mama?" Noria called from the other room, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Just checking what medicines might be useful for other sick people," Mama Ino replied calmly. "No point in wasting what could help someone else." She examined each bottle carefully, holding them up to the light, shaking them gently, even opening a few to smell their contents. Most were ordinary vitamins, pain relievers, the usual remedies for everyday ailments. But the heart medication bottle made her pause. The pills looked correct, small, white, round, identical to what any pharmacy would dispense. But when Mama Ino touched one to her tongue, tasting it with the careful expertise of someone who had been working with medicinal substances for decades, she detected something that made her spit immediately.
Wrong.
These pills tasted wrong. She slipped the bottle into her pocket and replaced it with an empty one from her bag, continuing her search as if nothing had happened. "Find anything useful?" Noria asked when she emerged from the bathroom. "Just the usual things," Mama Ino replied. "Nothing special." But that night, alone in her herb shop, she subjected the pills to every test she knew. She dissolved them in water and watched the color change. She ground them to powder and examined the residue. She compared them to genuine heart medication she obtained from a trusted pharmacy. The results confirmed her suspicions. These pills contained something that would do the opposite of regulating a heart rhythm. They were designed to cause exactly the kind of cardiac event that had killed Amara, or rather, that had appeared to kill her. "Poison," she whispered to her cat, who sat watching with unblinking eyes. "Murder disguised as medicine." The next morning, She sought out Amara at the small room behind the church where she had been staying since her return. The evidence felt heavy in her pocket, solid proof of a sister's betrayal. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, producing the bottle. Amara took it with trembling hands, recognition dawning in her eyes as she read the familiar label. "My heart medicine," she whispered. "I took this every morning, trusted it to keep me healthy." "Someone replaced the real medication with poison," Mama Eno explained. "Someone who had access to your medicine cabinet, who knew your routines, who could make the switch without arousing suspicion." "Noria," Amara breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer for the damned.
"Yes."
"But having proof and getting justice are two different things. People will need to see with their own eyes who your sister really is." Amara stared at the bottle, this small container that represented such an enormous betrayal. Her own sister had not just wished her dead, she had actively, deliberately, methodically murdered her. "It was Noria," she whispered again, as if saying the words might make them less true. But truth, once spoken, has a way of demanding recognition. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the town like dark fingers reaching for secrets, Amara made her way to the house she had once shared with her sister. She moved quietly, more out of habit than stealth, and found Noria sitting in the front room, staring at nothing with eyes that looked haunted. "We need to talk," Amara said simply, settling into the chair across from her sister. Noria startled like someone waking from a nightmare. "You shouldn't be here. People will see, we'll talk." "Let them talk. We have more important things to discuss." For a long moment, the sisters sat in silence, two women who had shared a womb, a childhood, a house, but never, Amara realized now, truly shared love. "Why me?" Amara asked finally. "I need to understand, Noria. Why did you want me dead?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Noria replied automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. "The pills. The heart medication. You replaced them with poison." Noria's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: denial, fear, calculation, and finally, a kind of relief. As if she was tired of carrying the secret alone. "Prove it," she said defiantly. "Prove that I did anything wrong." "I don't need to prove it to anyone but you," Amara replied gently. "I just need to understand why. Was I such a terrible sister? Did I hurt you somehow without realizing?" The kindness in her voice seemed to break something inside Noria. Suddenly, she was on her feet, pacing, her hands gesturing wildly as words poured out like water from a broken dam. "You want to know why?" she screamed. "Because everything you had should have been mine. The job at the clinic, I applied first, but they took one look at your beautiful smile and hired you instead. Oba, he came to this house to meet me, but you walked in, and he forgot I existed. The whole town loves you, praises you, talks about how wonderful you are, while I'm invisible. Noria. I'm the older sister," she continued, her voice rising to a shriek. "I'm the one who should have been special, should have been chosen, should have been loved. But no, everyone looks at me and sees nothing, looks at you and sees everything." Amara stood slowly, her heart breaking for the pain in her sister's voice, even as she recognized the danger in her wild eyes. "I would have shared everything with you," she said softly. "If you had just asked, if you had just told me how you felt." "Share?" Noria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't share being someone's first choice. You can't share being the one people remember when they tell stories. You can't share being the one who matters. So you decided to kill me instead." "I decided to make you disappear," Noria corrected, her voice suddenly cold. "Just disappear. So I could finally find out what it felt like to be the sister everyone missed." "And how does it feel?" Amara asked. "Terrible," Noria admitted, and for a moment she looked like the little girl she had once been, lost and confused and desperate for love. "It feels terrible." But the moment of vulnerability passed, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "But you're supposed to be dead," she said, her eyes focusing on Amara with predatory intensity. You're supposed to stay dead. She lunged forward with something in her hand. Amara couldn't see what, but the glint of metal caught the lamplight. Amara dodged, tripped, fell backward over the chair, her head striking the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. And as darkness closed over her vision, the last thing she saw was Noria standing above her, breathing hard, holding a kitchen knife that reflected the light like a silver tear. Consciousness returned to Amara slowly, accompanied by the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. She opened her eyes to discover she was no longer in her childhood home, but in Mama Ino's herb shop, tied to a chair in the back room while fire consumed the walls around her. Through the smoke, she could see Noria silhouetted in the doorway, her face illuminated by the growing flames, her expression strange and distant, as if she were watching a play rather than committing murder. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," Noria called over the sound of burning wood. "But you won't stay dead, and I can't live with you haunting me forever." Amara struggled against the ropes, but her movements were sluggish from whatever Noria had used to drug her. The smoke was thickening, and she could feel the heat beginning to sear her lungs with each breath. "Noria, please," she gasped. "You don't have to do this. We can work things out. We can—" "No," her sister replied, her voice eerily calm. "This is the only way. The fire will destroy any evidence, and everyone will think it was an accident. The old woman meddled with things she shouldn't have, and now she'll pay the price. And you'll finally stay dead." But as Noria turned to leave, she found her path blocked by a crowd of people. Oba in the lead, followed by Mama Ino herself, Pastor Williams, and half the town. Word had spread quickly when smoke had been spotted rising from the herb shop, and the community had responded as communities do in times of crisis. "Let her go," Oba said, his voice steady but his eyes blazing with fury. "She's already dead," Noria replied, but she was backing away from the crowd, her confidence faltering in the face of so many witnesses. "She should have stayed dead." "Step aside, child," Mama Ino commanded, pushing past Noria with surprising strength for her age. "Let us help her." While the men formed a bucket brigade to fight the flames, Mama Ino and the women rushed into the burning building to free Amara from her bonds. The ropes had been tied with desperate haste rather than skill, and they came loose quickly under experienced hands. "Can you walk?" Oba asked as he lifted Amara in his arms. She nodded, coughing out smoke and trauma, but alive, again, when she should have been dead. As they carried her to safety, the crowd turned to look at Noria, who stood at the edge of the circle of firelight with her face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes wild with the realization that she had been caught in the act of attempted murder. "It was supposed to work this time," she whispered to herself. "It was supposed to finally work. But fires, like truth, have a way of illuminating things that were meant to stay hidden." And now the whole community had witnessed exactly what kind of person Noria really was. As the bucket brigade worked to contain the fire, preventing it from spreading to neighboring buildings, a circle formed around Noria. Not threatening, not violent, but undeniably accusatory. The evidence of what she had tried to do was literally smoking behind her. "You set this fire," Pastor Williams said, his voice heavy with disappointment rather than anger. "You tied your own sister in there to burn alive." "She's not my sister," Noria screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "My sister is dead. This is some kind of demon, some kind of curse that won't leave me alone." "I saw you running from the fire," testified Mama Joyce. "Running away while someone was trapped inside." "We all saw you," added Papa Brahim. "Saw you standing there watching it burn like you were enjoying it." Noria's head whipped back and forth, seeking an escape route, a sympathetic face, anyone who might believe her increasingly desperate explanations. But the crowd's mood had shifted. These were people who had known both sisters their entire lives, who had watched Amara give selflessly to the community while Noria remained always on the periphery, always resentful, always angry. "Could it be Noria all along?" someone whispered, and the whisper spread through the crowd like wind through grain. "The poison in the medicine," murmured another voice. The way she took charge of the funeral arrangements so quickly. How she seemed almost happy when Amara died. The jealousy we all pretended not to see. As the accusations swirled around her, Noria began to laugh, a sound that started low and built to a pitch that made people step back and cross themselves. "You want to know the truth?" she screamed.
Fine.
"Yes, I replaced her medicine. Yes, I wanted her dead. Yes, I tried to burn her alive when poisoning her didn't work.
And you know what?
I'm not sorry. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being the sister nobody remembers. I'm tired of watching her get everything while I get nothing." The confession hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, shocking in its completeness even though everyone had begun to suspect the truth. Noria. Amara struggled to sit up from where the women were tending to her smoke inhalation. "Noria, we can still." "No." Noria backed away from the crowd, her eyes wild. "Don't you dare pity me now. Don't you dare try to forgive me. I meant every bit of it. I wanted you dead, and if I get another chance, I'll try again." With that, she turned and ran into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving behind a community stunned by the depth of hatred that had been hiding in their midst. "Should we go after her?" someone asked. "Let her go," Mama Eno said wearily. "She has condemned herself more thoroughly than any court could. The truth is out now, and that's what matters." As the crowd slowly dispersed, people helping to clean up from the fire, caring for the injured, restoring order to chaos, whispers followed them home. Could it be Noria all along? The answer, finally spoken and witnessed and undeniable, was yes. News of Noria's confession spread through the town like spilled oil, seeping into every conversation, every thought, every prayer. By morning, there wasn't a soul in the community who hadn't heard about the attempted murder, the arson, the sister who had tried twice to kill the woman everyone loved. But human nature is complex, and truth is often less comfortable than comfortable lies. A town meeting was called for Sunday after church, ostensibly to decide what should be done about the situation, but really to give people a chance to process their shock and guilt. Because they were all guilty, weren't they? Guilty of seeing Noria's envy and choosing to ignore it. Guilty of praising Amara so constantly that they had forgotten her sister existed. Guilty of creating the conditions that had allowed resentment to fester into murderous hatred. The community center filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the veranda. Amara sat in the front row, Oba beside her, both of them looking weary but determined to see justice done. Pastor Williams called for order, but before he could speak, a commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Noria had returned. She walked down the center aisle with her head held high, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow against her dark skin. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her demeanor that of someone attending a celebration rather than facing judgment for attempted murder. "My dear friends," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "I know there has been some confusion about recent events, and I've come to set the record straight." She settled into a chair that had been left empty, whether by coincidence or some unconscious community recognition that she would need to defend herself, and smiled at the assembled crowd as if she were about to deliver good news. "People have been saying terrible things about me," she continued, accusing me of things that are simply impossible. "But I want you all to know that I forgive these accusations, because I understand they come from fear and confusion about my sister's unusual return from the dead." The crowd exchanged glances. Was she really going to deny what dozens of people had witnessed? "The truth is," Noria said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a prepared speech, "that whatever came back from the grave wearing my sister's face is not Amara. My sister, my beloved sister, died 4 days ago and is at peace in heaven. What we have here is something else entirely, something that should not be among the living." A murmur ran through the crowd, not of agreement, but of disbelief at her audacity. "I know it's hard to accept," she pressed on, "but consider the evidence. People don't rise from the dead. Doctors don't make mistakes about death. What we're dealing with is clearly a supernatural deception, and as a God-fearing community, we should not be tolerating such abominations in our midst." She stood up, spreading her arms as if embracing the entire room. "I call upon you all to do what's right," she declared. "Send this demon back to where it came from, and let my sister rest in peace." But her performance fell flat. Too much had been seen, too much had been heard, too much truth had already been exposed for lies to take root again. The real question was not whether Noria was guilty, but what the community would do about it. Into the uncomfortable silence that followed Noria's speech, Mama Ino rose from her place, near the back of the room. The old woman moved slowly, her age showing in the careful way she navigated between chairs and people, but her voice when she spoke carried the authority of someone who had been reading truth and lies for 7 decades. "You want to speak of evidence, child?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Noria. "Then let us examine the evidence properly." She reached into the cloth bag she carried everywhere and withdrew the bottle of tampered pills, holding it up where everyone could see. "This is the heart medicine your sister took every morning, trusting it to keep her healthy," Mama Ino announced. "But these pills are not what they appear to be. Someone replaced the real medication with poison designed to cause exactly the kind of heart failure that killed Amara." A gasp ran through the crowd. Even those who had suspected the truth were shocked to see physical proof. "Anyone could have gotten those pills," Noria said quickly, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Anyone could have replaced them. You can't prove." "Oh, but I can," Mama Ino replied calmly. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a small glass vial filled with white powder. "This is the residue from those false pills. I have tested it with every method I know. It is not medicine, it is poison. And poison leaves traces." She walked closer to Noria, her ancient eyes fixed on the younger woman's face. "Poison leaves traces in the body of the victim," she said. "Poison leaves traces on the hands of the one who handles it. And poison leaves traces in the house where it is prepared." "You're lying," Noria whispered, but she was backing away from the old woman as if Mama Ino carried some infectious disease. "Am I?" Mama Ino asked. "Then you won't mind if we search your room, examine your belongings, test your hands for chemical residue?" "Truth hides in lies," the old woman continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of prophecy, "but lies burn in the light. Murder hides behind medicine, but medicine tells its own story. Envy hides behind grief, but grief that celebrates is not grief at all." She held up the bottle of tampered pills one more time, letting the afternoon light catch the glass. "This is the evidence you asked for," she declared. "The evidence that someone in this room tried to murder Amara Okoro. The evidence that someone replaced healing with poison, love with hate, sisterhood with envy so deep it demanded death." The crowd was completely silent now, all eyes moving between Mama Ino and Noria, waiting to see how the accused would respond to such concrete proof. But Noria's composure was finally, thoroughly cracking. Her white dress no longer looked elegant. It looked like a costume she had borrowed for a role she couldn't play. Her perfect makeup was beginning to run with sweat, and her hands shook as she pointed an accusing finger at Mama Ino. "She's a witch," Noria screamed. "She practices dark magic, calls back the dead. You should be questioning her, not believing her lies." "The only magic I practice," Mama Ino replied evenly, "is the magic of paying attention. And anyone who pays attention can see the truth written in your face, child. Guilty knowledge sits heavy on the soul." For a moment that felt like an eternity, the community center balanced on the knife's edge of decision. Mama Ino's evidence was compelling, but Noria's counteraccusation of witchcraft touched on fears that ran deep in the collective consciousness. Old superstitions die hard, and there were people in the room who remembered their grandparents' stories about women who could speak to the dead, who could call spirits back from beyond the grave. If Amara had truly died and returned, wasn't that proof that unnatural forces were at work? "Maybe we should consider," Mr. Emeka said hesitantly, "that both things could be true. Maybe Noria did poison her sister, and maybe Mama Ino used other methods to bring her back. Maybe we're dealing with both murder and witchcraft." A murmur of nervous agreement ran through part of the crowd. It was easier to blame supernatural forces than to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had all failed to see the hatred growing in their midst. "She admits she practices magic," added Mrs. Ochuba, pointing at Mama Ino. "She admits she worked spells over the body. Who knows what kind of demon she might have called into that corpse?" "Yes." Noria seized on the doubt like a drowning person grabbing a rope. "Don't you see? She's the one you should fear. She's the one who traffic with evil spirits. I may have made mistakes, but she's the one who brought this curse upon our community." But even as some people nodded uncertainly, others began to speak up, people who had known Mama Ino longer, who had benefited from her healing knowledge, who understood the difference between wisdom and evil. "Mama Ino helped birth half the children in this room," declared Mama Adunni. "Her medicines have saved more lives than we can count. She delivered my son when the doctor said he wouldn't survive," added Papa Cola. "If that's witchcraft, then witchcraft looks a lot like miracle work. And even if she did use unusual methods to help Amara," said Pastor Williams carefully, "that doesn't change the fact that someone tried to murder an innocent woman. The question before us is not whether we approve of Mama Ino's methods, but whether we will allow a murderer to go free." The crowd wavered, uncertain, torn between fear and justice, superstition and evidence. Into this uncertainty stepped Oba, rising from his chair beside Amara with the quiet authority of a man who had made up his mind. "I have something to say," he announced, and his voice carried clearly through the murmur of confused voices. Oba walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His hands were steady, his voice calm, but his eyes held the weight of a man who had watched the woman he loved die and return to life. "I want to tell you all what I witnessed 3 nights ago," he said. "What I saw when I couldn't sleep and went walking through the town." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "I saw Noria leaving Mama Ino's shop carrying a can of kerosene. I saw her pouring it around the walls, saw her light the fire that was meant to kill Amara a second time. I saw her stand watching the flames with satisfaction on her face." "He's lying," Noria shrieked, but her denial sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I saw her run when we arrived to fight the fire," Oba continued steadily. "I heard her confess to poisoning her sister's medicine. I watched her try to convince us that Amara was some kind of demon rather than face responsibility for what she had done." He turned to look directly at Noria, and his expression held more sorrow than anger. "But most importantly," he said, "I saw the look in her eyes when she thought Amara was dead. It wasn't grief. It wasn't loss. It was triumph. It was satisfaction. It was the look of someone who had finally gotten what they wanted." The crowd followed his gaze to Noria, who seemed to shrink under their collective scrutiny. "You want the truth?" she suddenly screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. "Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I poisoned her. Yes, I replaced her medicine with pills that would stop her heart. Yes, I wanted her dead." The confession exploded from her like water from a burst dam, all the rage and envy and bitter resentment pouring out in a torrent that left everyone stunned. "She took everything from me," Noria continued, tears streaming down her face, but tears of rage rather than remorse. "Everything I should have had. Everything I deserved. The job at the clinic, I was more qualified, but they chose her because she was prettier. Oba, he came to court me first, but she walked into the room and I became invisible. The whole town loves her, praises her, treats her like some kind of saint while I might as well not exist." She was pacing now, gesticulating wildly, 28 years of suppressed hatred finally finding voice. "Do you know what it's like to live in someone's shadow?" she demanded. "Do you know what it's like to be the sister nobody remembers, the one people look past, the one who gets the leftovers of everything?" She had love, respect, purpose, meaning. And what did I have? Nothing. Nothing but the knowledge that I was the older sister who should have been first, should have been chosen, should have been special. "So you decided to kill her," Pastor Williams said quietly. "I decided to make her disappear," Noria corrected, spinning to face him. "Just disappear." so I could find out what it felt like to be the one people missed, the one they talked about, the one who mattered. She collapsed into her chair, exhausted by the force of her own confession, but there was a strange relief in her face as well, the relief of someone who had finally spoken the truth, no matter how ugly it was. "And do you know what the worst part is?" she whispered, her voice broken but still bitter. "Even dead, even poisoned and buried and gone, she still got more love and attention than I ever did alive. Even her funeral was more beautiful than my entire life." The silence that followed was complete and profound. No one seemed to know what to say in the face of such raw, destructive honesty. Finally, Amara stood up. She walked slowly to where her sister sat collapsed and broken, and knelt down beside her chair. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I'm sorry that loving me meant you couldn't love yourself. I'm sorry that my light made you feel like you were living in shadow. I'm sorry that I never saw your pain clearly enough to help heal it." But Noria pulled away from her sister's gentle touch, as if it burned. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't you dare forgive me. Don't you dare try to make this about your goodness and my badness. I'm not sorry. I'm not repentant. I'm just done." In the aftermath of Noria's confession, the community center emptied slowly, people leaving in small groups with their heads together, processing what they had witnessed. Some seemed relieved that the truth was finally out. Others appeared shaken by the depth of hatred they had failed to recognize. But as the crowd dispersed, Father Okoro, who had arrived during the confession and heard everything from the back of the room, approached the small group still gathered around the two sisters. "I came here to perform an exorcism," he said quietly, his voice very different from the theatrical boom he typically employed. "Someone convinced me that your community was being plagued by a demon pretending to be a dead woman." He looked at Noria, who sat staring at the floor with empty eyes. "I realize now that the demon was not the one who returned from the dead," he continued. "The demon was the envy that lived in a sister's heart, feeding on resentment until it grew strong enough to demand murder." He placed a gentle hand on Noria's shoulder, and she didn't pull away. She seemed beyond caring about anyone's touch. "You are cursed," he told her, but his voice held compassion rather than condemnation. "Cursed by your own hatred, your own inability to find joy in anyone else's happiness. You have poisoned yourself more thoroughly than you poisoned your sister's medicine." "What will happen to her?" Amara asked, still kneeling beside Noria's chair. "That is for God and the authorities to decide," Father Okoro replied. "But I suspect her punishment has already begun. She will have to live with the knowledge of what she has done, the isolation of being known as someone who tried to murder her own sister. That is a heavy burden to carry." As if his words had broken some final dam, Noria began to weep. Not the theatrical tears she had performed during the funeral preparations, but deep, soul-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she had kept locked away for decades. "I can't take it back," she whispered between sobs. "I can't undo what I did. I can't make myself into someone who could be happy for you instead of jealous of you." "No," Amara agreed sadly. "You can't take it back, but you can choose what to do next." But Noria was already standing, already moving toward the door with the mechanical movements of someone who has given up on everything. "There is no next for me," she said without looking back. "There's just a way. Somewhere far enough away that I never have to see your face and be reminded of everything I'm not." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, and spoke without turning around. "I hope you'll be happy," she said, and for the first time in her life, she sounded like she meant it. "I hope you'll have everything I was too broken to want for you." Then she was gone, walking out into the afternoon sun toward the road that led to other towns, other lives, other possibilities for someone willing to start over without the poison of envy eating away at their soul. The community would whisper about her for months, then years, then gradually forget as new scandals and tragedies claimed their attention. But her reputation would remain. The sister who had tried to murder the woman everyone loved, the woman whose jealousy had been so consuming that she had chosen destruction over sharing joy. It was a kind of justice, though not the kind anyone would have chosen. 6 months later, Life in the small town had settled into new patterns around the truth everyone now knew. Amara had returned to work at the clinic, where she was welcomed not as someone who had returned from the dead, but as someone who had survived an attempt on her life and chosen forgiveness over bitterness. She and Oba married quietly on a Tuesday morning, with Mama Ino standing as witness and the pastor offering a blessing that focused on second chances and the resilience of love. The community celebrated appropriately, but there was an undercurrent of solemnity to the festivities, a recognition that they had all learned something about the dangers of praise that excludes and attention that overlooks. No one had heard from Noria since the day she left town. Some said she had gone to the capital to start over. Others claimed she had joined a convent, seeking penance and service to God. A few maintained that she had simply disappeared, unable to live with the weight of her actions. But Mama Ino, who had returned to her herb shop and her quiet practice of healing, sometimes caught word of a woman in distant towns who worked with sick children, who seemed driven to help others in a way that suggested she was trying to balance some internal scale of justice. Perhaps, she told her cat one evening as she ground herbs for a fever remedy, redemption is possible even for those who choose murder over sharing. But it comes at a price that few are willing to pay. The real change in the community was subtler, but more lasting. People became more careful about their praise, more inclusive in their attention, more aware that constant comparison could breed the kind of resentment that destroyed families. Parents told their children the story of the two sisters as a warning. Envy is a poison that hurts the one who carries it most of all. And in the church, where Amara and Oba worshipped each Sunday, a new saying appeared in the pastor's sermons with increasing frequency. Truth cannot be buried. Love cannot be murdered. And God's justice works through human hands, but also beyond human understanding. On quiet evenings, when Amara sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of forgiveness, she sometimes thought about Noria. Not with anger or fear, but with the kind of sadness reserved for understanding that comes too late to prevent tragedy. She had learned that love alone was not enough, that sometimes love needed to be accompanied by attention to those who felt unloved, understanding for those who struggled with self-worth, and the wisdom to see danger before it grew large enough to demand death as its price. But she had also learned that life was stronger than death, that truth was more persistent than lies, and that communities could choose healing over revenge when they were brave enough to confront their own failures. The town whispered her story for years to come. Truth cannot be buried, they would say, ending the tale with a kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing justice done and mercy extended in equal measure. And the moral that emerged from those whispers was simple but profound. Envy digs graves, but truth always rises. What lesson did you learn from this story? Comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more folktales.